Haere mai ki tēnei hui o te kaunihira. Welcome to our very first workshop for the annual plan 2025 to 26. Just a reminder to everyone that this meeting is being live streamed. And before we get underway, I'll ask Councillor Maxwell to open us up with a karakia.
Kia ora koutou katoa, he ino I tātou, let us pray. Tūtawa mai I runga, tūtawa mai I raro, tūtawa mai I roto, tūtawa mai I waho. Kia tau ai, te Māori tū, te Māori ora ki te katoa. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora, thank you very much, Councillor Maxwell. Just a reminder to everyone to please have your mobile phones on silent. And also, we anticipate that this should be finished by lunchtime, so we will just carry on through without a break, but we'll see how we go depending on what questions may come up. This first workshop is really going to set the scene as a reminder of what we had adopted in the previous long-term plan. So we're going to hand over to Thomas to take us through a bit of a scene setting of where we're at now. And I also welcome Councillor Kiriopa, who's just joined us by Zoom. Morena.
Thank you, Your Worship, and good morning, councillors. Can you just click on? Thank you. It should be a fairly brief presentation. I'm happy to stop at some key points to answer questions and dive into some things, but what we will be covering is just a high-level timeline, just reminding ourselves again of the LTP and the context, and considering we did adopt our LTP 4 months ago, what underpinned the long-term plan, which was the financial strategy, a little bit of a recap of what makes up year 2, and in particular we'll go into a bit of a dive into what makes up the capital works program, and then we'll just touch on some of the factors that we know have changed, but we haven't yet modelled. So what we are going to show you is exactly what has been set in year 2 of our LTP before we start taking into account things that have changed in the last 4 months. So, just a reminder, the long-term plan was adopted back in June 2024, quite a comprehensive piece of work that sets out the financial strategy and direction and the investment that we're going to make into the community for the next 10 years. And we're now currently 4 months into year 1 of the LTP, and we're now starting the journey with regards to looking at year 2. And just as a reminder, year 2, what we're talking about, the budgets, is for the year that will commence 1 July. I heard a collective sigh from my team when I said 1 June incorrectly. 1 July 2025. So the timeline, so we are Workshop 1, we're going to have a bit of a recap. We are planning 4 more workshops this side of Christmas. So what we'd like to do is a recap for year 1, for Workshop 1, sorry. Workshop 2 will be around elected members, trying to understand the opportunities, what may have changed in your views, and those sorts of things. Workshop 3 will be bringing in considerations from what the organisation is currently working on is around the organisational reset, and Phase 2 is looking at each of our activities and how we do things and how we become more efficient and effective, or focusing on how we can better focus on our community and our customers. And then Workshop 4, which will be just before Christmas, should be about here are a revised year 2, what it looks like, and here are some of the things you may want to have a conversation with the community on in the new year. So if it is significant, then we'd consult, or if not, would you still like to have some form of discussion around what makes up year 2? We'll come back over the Christmas period after you've pondered and considered and potentially had some feedback, and then we'll look to finalise and adopt a consultation document if required, and then go out for consultation in April, followed by hearings and deliberations with an adoption in June. And so that's the timeline ahead of us. If there is a need for more workshops after Christmas, then we do have that flexibility in either late January or February to still have those workshops and work through anything that we may need to. So, just a reminder, the long-term plan, and in particular year 2, is just an extension of that long-term plan, is around what we're looking to deliver, and underpinning that is Council's 9 priorities or 9 outcomes, and so there's no change in that, and in particular some strong focus on ensuring that, connected and resilient community, a big focus on tourism and our visitors, employment opportunities, housing. It recognises we're a very active community, and so a lot of the investment that we have should invest in how our community participates and acts. Looking after our environment, quite a strong focus on safety and community safety, as well as underpinning Te Aroha and also the arts and the culture. So no overall change in that aspect. When we put the LTP together, you may recall I was sitting here or up there and probably described the one of the hardest environments of preparing a long-term plan that I've ever had in my career, and I've done all but one LTP in the cycle, so I think I've done about 5 instead of the 6. And so at the time of starting our journey on the long-term plan, we had the uncertainty around the government Three Waters reforms, whether we were planning for our infrastructure or not, was it part of council or not. We had a lot of regulatory and compliance pressures coming in with some legislative changes, and that was driving costs and extra resource into our organisation. It was very difficult to actually engage contractors, and there were huge labour shortages. It was really at that pinnacle of where we saw inflation almost peaking, and the challenges that was causing not only New Zealand, but we also now have seen that impact worldwide as well. And in particular for us, while CPI was up, and it was a higher number than what people expected, the cost of goods that council buys isn't directly tied to that CPI, and so we were seeing costs, in particular around our infrastructure space and our investment in that space, well above the headline CPI and adjustments. But it was pleasing that we were one of about a third of all councils in New Zealand that actually adopted the long-term plan on time. The next third have just completed their long-term plans back in September, so they had a 3-month extension, and there were also some councils that elected not to do a long-term plan and will now be starting that journey as we speak, and they did an annual plan. And they predominantly did that because of the uncertainty on the Three Waters in particular and the cost of their infrastructure that was impacting them. And so for us, Three Waters reform, big part, we picked the pathway with regards to we all still have ownership and control of our assets, and that Three Water reform has now changed. But what we'll talk about later is there'll still be a little bit of uncertainty and impact on that with regards to the current government's plans and what they're asking us to do. Big focus on resilience of our service provisions. Another one on the reputation of Rotorua, with quite a bit of investment in supporting Rotorua and Z and to help position ourselves in a much better space, and also investment into our community safety, resilience of infrastructure and climate change. And so those were some of the big themes and topics. Sorry, yes, Your Worship.
Sorry, I might ask a quick question there and invite anyone else if they do have questions. Are you okay to take questions? I think it might be easier. Just regarding inflation, that was obviously a significant challenge for us when setting the long-term plan just gone. Going into the annual plan, is there any updated information that we can look at in terms of seeing if the forecasted inflation is correct? Yeah.
Yep, so we have got revised inflation factors from Burl. Burl is the entity that does that work for us. I would describe it as flatlining with a slight decline. So it has, in some areas of our business, the inflation has dropped lower than what was forecast, but in other areas it has actually gone higher than forecast. And one example is, I think the team mentioned water. So the inflation factor there, and that's just a recognition of the costs that drive that particular activity. But we are expecting a flat line or a small decrease overall, but not the decrease you're kind of seeing with regards to the headline inflation that you're seeing publicly with the Reserve Bank recently claiming success against getting headline inflation close to the band. I think it was 2 point something, so it's almost within that band. So remembering headline inflation makes up a lot of individual factors, and they all combine together. And so for us, our bucket or our basket of services that we acquire are more closer to what we'd forecast rather than closer to what we're now seeing that headline CPI inflation at. But what we will do in a future workshop is provide you a little bit more detail on that when we start modelling all the things that have changed. So unfortunately, no, we don't expect a significant drop in our inflation factor to help drive our rates lower at this point.
Question from Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can we see the Burl report as part of the information that we get?
Yep, that's no problem.
Thank you.
So when we put the long-term plan together, we did use this decision-making process, and just a little bit of a reminder. And it was around creating a baseline financial model, which was the red line, dotted line that goes through the diagram, and above the line was really our baseline budgets and the priority one of things that we did have to respond to and we had no choice to, and that was interest rates increasing, challenges around staffing, making sure that we were funding our depreciation to ensure that we were funding our renewal project, the impact of inflation and CPI. And we had a lot of contractual obligations as well tied to many of our service contracts. Legal and regulatory challenges, and then making sure then we put all that together, that we were running a balanced budget. So in doing so, we were funding our operation costs correctly through operational revenues, and that we were only borrowing for the things that we should have been borrowing for, which is predominantly level of service improvements or growth, which is ultimately funded by development contributions. We then had priority 2 and 3, went through that exercise of what are the other council's priorities that we'd like to consider, and then priority 3 was around changes to our levels of service, which went into that decision-making process that ultimately we consulted on via our consultation document, and from that we landed on our draft long-term plan, which was adopted in June. And overall, the long-term plan itself and the themes was around maintaining our existing infrastructure, so making sure we were funding our renewals, we had good renewal programs, and we were looking after the assets that we had. On top of that, we were understanding growth, and we were investing into growth, and part of that was tied to our development contributions policy of how we fund for that growth, but making sure, first of all, ensuring that the infrastructure was being put in to accommodate growth, that we were delivering on our community outcomes that we talked about before around a resilient community, housing, safety, open spaces. That we're good stewards of our assets, trying to find a balance between affordability and again, that we were using debt prudently, and that it was only supporting a particular infrastructure and growth, and that we were managing debt in a way that over the life of the plan, the goal that you set us was around creating more borrowing headroom towards the end of that our long-term plan, and that we were using debt appropriately, and in particular in those first 3 years around supporting our infrastructure program.
I just got a question from Councillor Kaifong.
Thomas, just going back to that slide. So we were supposed to be above the dotted line where we were doing OPEX where it was effectively a requirement, and CAPEX, which was we ensured that we were doing our renewals, which and all the other stuff which is in that other box. But we really didn't delve into that box and that blue one, where considering levels of service priorities, the funding policies and new fees, and the reductions to levels of service. I don't believe we really looked into that in any detail, and is there an opportunity to do that this time round?
We did probably spend more time on those looking at levels of service in the annual plan before, which helps set the baseline budgets for this. You might recall we spent quite a bit of time consulting on that. The long-term plan in particular was very much geared towards ensuring our infrastructure was looked after and well maintained and all the rest. So going forward, yes, there could be an opportunity if the council wishes to explore and look at what our levels of service are going forward, just making sure that we are balancing that between that it doesn't trigger a long-term plan amendment, or if it does, then you just need to be aware that there's quite a significant piece of work that would be required to support that. But you do have the ability in these next few workshops to ask questions around levels of service and what you may like to change if that is something you wish to do.
So what bandwidth of change would actually be within the business as usual as against major change that would require an amendment to an LTP, just so that we can kind of understand what is the level of change that councillors may be prepared to consider or look at?
So we're predominantly guided by the principles in our significance and engagement policy, but I'll give an example, and this is a really ridiculous example, but we're not going to provide sewerage activities, wastewater treatment plants and all the rest, and we decided that we don't want to play in that space, and we're going to sell all those assets and get someone else to deliver it. That's an example of something that you'd have to consult on. That's a really ridiculous example for the record. So, but yeah, or turning something off like we no longer want to provide sports fields for our community, and that they should provide them for themselves. So things significant such as turning things off and big important things would require consultation.
So if we were just deciding to still do stuff, but maybe not maybe at a 5-star gold service, or we might decide we'll only do half the level or 3/4 of a level, that would still be within.
Yep, so we'd consult on that in our annual plan consultation document, but won't likely trigger a long-term plan amendment. And by triggering a long-term plan amendment, it means you have to pretty much redo your long-term plan to show the impact of that. So yes, if the impact of change is relatively minor overall on the council's long-term plan, then we would consult as part of the annual plan and move forward and not have to do an LTP amendment.
Just one final question, Your Worship. So if we were to have an amended efficiencies target, which we had before, that wouldn't trigger necessarily a requirement to consult if it was a across-the-board savings that staff and the organisation were required to find, as opposed to individually picking services, which is what we did last time around. So I don't believe that when we did the 500,000 efficiency target, that was necessarily consulted on directly.
No, it would have been. It was stated that it was in there, but it's $1 million, but it's not something specifically that we need to consult on. If, however, some of those, in way of delivering those, it leads to a material impact in the drop in levels of service to our community, then so that would be something we'd need to consult on.
Thank you.
Yep. So, year 2. What does it look like? I think year 2 is probably, from a capital delivery perspective, our biggest year. You'll recall that the first 3 years of our long-term plan has quite a significant investment into our infrastructure, and year 2 is the peak of that currently. So overall, it has operating revenues of about 189 million. On top of that is also capital subsidies and development contributions. We have operating costs of about 155 million, leading to an operating surplus of 34 million. Now that surplus helps pay for debt, retirement, but also funds our renewal program. So there's a direct correlation between us needing an operating surplus to fund for the renewal of our infrastructure. Investment into infrastructure overall is 147 million, so that's the biggest we'll ever plan to do. slightly bigger than the year that we're currently underway now. And that's being supported by borrowings, net borrowings of about 41 million, external funding from a range of sources, NZTA, government funding to support museum, etc., development contributions of 10, and again, the operating surplus helps contribute towards that as well. So what changed, or what does year 2 include? So of the forecast rates increase, inflation makes up about 5 million of the additional rates requirement, and so that's just a reflection of the forecast inflation at the time of doing the plan, and as we talked about before, of where it currently sits for us as well. As well as that, interest and financing costs on the back of quite significant investment into our infrastructure, the new debt, the new interest and servicing of that debt. Operating costs around our staffing, but also around increasing some of our maintenance budgets to look after our assets. And we had quite a heavy focus, in particular over the first 5 years of the long-term plan, of ensuring that we're staying as close as possible to funding our depreciation, which funds our renewal program. And we have we did have a shortfall at the start of year 1 of the LTP, and that's a reflection of, you'll recall, those big valuation gains that we had in our infrastructure, which then drives a higher depreciation, which then drives also a higher renewal cost, and so playing catch up on some of those challenges. In particular, the first 5 years of the long-term plan, we had quite an aggressive strategy of fully funding our depreciation going forward, which helped towards the tail end of the plan of reducing debt as well. So, rates revenue for year 2. So what I'm going to talk about is exactly as per the plan, and then later in December we'll talk about all the things that have changed, and we'll take you through some of those aspects of how these all come together. So 9.8. Very close spread between general rate and targeted rate. So whereas year 1, the 11.4 was heavily weighted towards the targeted rates, which on average were closer to 15, but we're being pulled down by the general rate. Year 2 is, I think, the general rate's about 9.5, and the targeted rates are about 10.2 or 10.5. So they're both combining to a 9.8. So the distribution of the rates is a lot closer and similar than what we had in year 1. So what's driving that increase, and by the activity? So you'll see there that, and each of those activities will have different factors. So by far, the waste and sustainability was probably the higher of them all, and that's tied to FOGO, which we can talk about later around the deferment of the FOGO program into year 2. Stormwater is a reflection of the investment into the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, the $120 odd million worth of work around our providing stormwater to enable growth. Community safety as well, with a response to the levels of service in that space around staffing, external services, CCTV, etc. And so those are some of the bigger drivers with regards to the activities driving the change. When you look at it, what underlying is changing it, inflation makes up about 34% of that proposed increase. Finance costs make up close to 29%, so that's a reflection of the investment into our capital works program. The operating costs itself, with regards to inflation adjustments, levels of service changes, make up 15%, and 22% that's what we talked about with regards to that aggressive nature of funding our depreciation to fund our renewals, makes up the balance of 22. And so those are the cost drivers that are driving it, and then off to the other side, those are the activities that are absorbing it or driving it individually, factors as well. Happy to pause here and answer any questions you may have on this slide.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Your Worship. Finance costs chew up a lot, obviously. Is there a benchmark or is there a conversation going on nationwide around what's appropriate for local government to have in this space?
There is a discussion in particular around I can't call it Three Waters reform anymore, but what's it called now? Water's Done Well, around what's an appropriate level of debt to support the infrastructure. So the challenge we have as an organisation is that our ability to borrow is tied to a percentage on our revenue, but and that's across our organisation, but there are many activities that drive revenues that don't actually borrow, and there are some activities that are very resource hungry and need significant investment, and which predominantly drive our debt. And if you were not in a local government world but in a commercial world, those sorts of entities that have that level of capital investment, say an airport, take Auckland Airport for example with regards to its infrastructure investment, if you tried to limit that entity to the percentages that we have, it couldn't do what it needed to do. And I think that's the question that the Water's Done Well is asking, and asking as to whether moving those assets to another entity that can borrow at a much higher leverage rate than what core council is a better way to fund and deliver those services.
Thank you. I think the difference is that you'll get a return on the investment if you put money into Auckland Airport versus what we'll get, and it's just a straight costs. But anyway, I don't know that you answered the question. You think in your mind 29% is sustainable given the challenges for our ratepayers?
That 29% is a reflection of the underlying capital works program that we've got. And so if we talk about what makes up with that, responding to stormwater to facilitate growth, $100 million investment into our wastewater treatment plant and a contact bed, $29 million into a Tarawera sewage scheme, it's up to you as to ask yourself the question of, are those projects that the community should be investing in?
Thank you.
Sorry, just to confirm, Thomas, so that's percentage change, not percentage in terms of dollar spend?
Yeah, that's the percentage of the increase, yeah.
Of the increase, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, yeah.
It's definitely not, yeah.
Councillor Lee?
No, you just answered my question. Thank you, Mayor Tapsell.
So when we take another look, and I'm just trying something a little bit different here with these images to try and give you context of the activities that drive our rates, but also, and where our costs are being allocated as well. So this is an image of, I guess if we looked at our total rates take of, I think on the previous page was 160 million, of how that is allocated, and by far the largest portion is spaces, places and rec, which is made up of our open spaces, all of our reserves, aquatic centres, events and venues, and all our community facilities. The next largest component is our wastewater network, our wastewater treatment plant, and you can kind of see so forth. And so there are, I guess, a number of key activities that are driving the majority of our rates allocation and the investment that we're having. When you take it at a different view with regards to our operating expenditure and how it sits, that yellow is really horrible on there, my apologies. There are two big drivers. We are an organisation that significantly relies on our staff to deliver many of our services, so that's a big component of our cost. The next one is depreciation, so making sure that we are funding our renewal program. Interest expense is the next big one with regards to servicing our debt, and our debt being used to invest in our infrastructure. And then you can see there that there's a number of larger contracts that make up, or activities that make up the next component. And so I think when Deputy Worship was talking about levels of service and those sorts of aspects, you'll see that, with regards to our cost base, a lot of it is tied up and locked up into big chunks. And so if you are therefore wanting to look at some efficiencies and effectiveness discussions around focusing those around where some of these bigger costs sit. So that was the intention of what I'm trying to represent there. I don't know if it succeeded or not, so happy to take any questions on this slide or not.
Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Thomas. Just other, there's a fairly large block on that graph. What is other?
So that makes up pretty much everything else that you don't see on there. Could be such as things as election costs, printing, those sorts of all the other miscellaneous costs that we need to support our organisation, legal costs, that aspects.
Thank you. Councillor Kaifong.
Thank you, Chair. Are councils able to, because this is already in the LTP, have more detail about what's actually included in those individual boxes together with the amounts? Because is there an opportunity to look at delaying or deferring some of those levels of service projects or some of the renewal projects?
Around levels of service, yes. I think the challenge around deferring renewals is I'd hate for us to go backwards to pre-2013 where we were an organisation that was making political decisions around which renewal would go ahead or not, and we were underfunding our renewal program, which led to significant investment to have to play catch up. So if we move on the basis of our renewals are based on asset management plans, and those asset management plans are designed to look after our assets, then we should be funding those correctly. And if not, then you need to make a decision as to whether you want that asset or not to defer the asset. But around levels of service in our capital works program, yes, you definitely can go there if you wish. Also on renewals if you wish to go there as well.
So I think, is there an opportunity for councils, if they had the more detailed information sitting in behind those two slides, for councils then to have that discussion or to be able to ask more detailed questions about what's sitting in there of you later?
Sure, certainly. There's that opportunity, particularly going into the second workshop around the elected member feedback and that to consider a whole range of things, yes.
Okay, so if we could have that detail, that would be great. Thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Worship. Just can you remind me what our policy is on funding depreciation? Is it 100%?
Yeah, so we don't quite fund 100% because we get external funding like from NZTA, so we shouldn't double dip on it. But as I said, in the first 5 years of the long-term plan, we're moving as close as possible to that 100% as we can. Because we should be funding our renewal program from operational revenues, and by not funding depreciation but still doing the renewals, we would then have to use debt to maintain our existing assets, which is not a financially prudent decision to make.
But you could potentially defer some depreciation from this year to next year, say to smooth out rates increases?
You can, but I think, as I said before, we'd then be at risk of moving into a similar position where we were pre-2013, where we had an organisation that wasn't funding depreciation because of individual decisions, and we had a significant investment and catch-up that needed to be made. So
I don't know what happened in 2013, but there are some levers to pull there, really, is what I'm saying, potentially.
Yep. So, just recognising that if you wish to defer renewals, you're just deferring that cost to a future year.
Correct. That's my point, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And following on from Councillor Brown's line of questioning, depreciation is really a taxation concept, isn't it?
Well, it's recognition of the utilisation of the asset over its life. So, yep.
Well, over its life as defined by inland revenue?
No, we're a tax-exempt entity and our depreciation rates are set based on individual asset classes and asset management plans, not by the IRD.
Okay, so let's suppose can you give us an example of something that's depreciated over a period of time?
Everything.
Yes, just one example.
The table you're currently sitting in front of.
Okay, so you don't follow the inland revenue depreciation rates for these tables?
No, so let me be very clear, Councillor. an organisation, and particularly large organisations that are taxable, will generally have two asset registers. One with regards for management purposes around its useful lives and replacement of its assets, and two, a tax one for IRD purposes. We're tax exempt, so we don't follow the IRD depreciation rates.
Okay.
So we have...
So the depreciation rates that you do use, are they actually based upon the lifetime of the asset?
Yep, so we engage a lot of expensive organisations and consultants to help us build our infrastructure strategy and our asset management plans that look at individual assets and their useful lives and so forth. And we actually have a team downstairs in our infrastructure team that constantly is updating our asset registers and understanding the useful lives of those remaining assets and depreciating them appropriately.
Okay, thank you.
Just checking if there were any further questions. No, thank you, Thomas.
Capital expenditure. So I think I mentioned before 145 million. It's 139 uninflated. So my apologies, some of these numbers are inflated and uninflated. So you'll see there second largest year with regards to the 10 years of the long-term plan. Overall, the split between where that investment going is, let me just look at the colours, predominantly levels of service, so that's no reflection of the investment into the wastewater treatment plant, the IEF, and in particular also the museum, and then the balance of them is split pretty evenly between growth, but also our renewals. So I'm not sure whether this was what the Deputy Mayor was asking as to the level of detail of our capital works program, and so the next three slides makes up those individual components. So this is how the proposed renewal program sits from highest to lowest, and you'll see there that predominantly the majority of the renewal funding sits towards our infrastructure and our buildings. And it's spread across a whole range of individual asset classes. The next one is improving our levels of service. So some of these projects will draw on our debt as well. So whereas renewals are predominantly funded from our operating revenues or external funding, and you'll again of the 62 million, by and far the majority of the proportion of the spend sits with the museum seismic strengthening, the wastewater treatment plant upgrade, finishing Tarawera sewage scheme, and then supporting some of our district waters supplies and some of our other infrastructure improvements across the board. Again, predominantly focused on our infrastructure. And then the third category is growth, and so this is predominantly tied to our development contributions, or the IEF as well, and that's around our stormwater master planning to facilitate growth. Improvements to our wastewater network to support growth, stormwater and transport as well. So with that, happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, the slide previously that talked about the Rotorua Museum exhibition being 3.2 million, I thought we were only dealing with the infrastructure, the structure of the building, and not the internal fit-out. What is that?
So, Councillor, you might recall we've got about a $9 million project sitting in the long-term plan to support the exhibition, but it is all externally funded. So it is sitting there as an item with regards to investment needed, but because that funding isn't currently there, that work is currently on hold.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have to show that even though we haven't got the money.
Correct.
Yeah. Right. Thank you.
Councillor Brown.
It's a question for you, Madam Chair, really. How do you want to deal with this? Do you want to start picking the eyes out of this stuff, or how do you want to do that?
Yeah, we'll take today as an information session so that basically this was a great opportunity for us to have a refreshed perspective on what was in the long-term plan year 2. As elected members, we can then have a discussion on it, and we'll come back for the next workshop to be able to delve into more detail once we've passed on that feedback to staff. So it will be quite a lengthy process getting through this annual plan, but we're going to take it in stages.
External borrowings. So this is the debt profile that sits in our long-term plan. So at the moment, we will model changes eventually with regards to changes potentially of the capital works program, timing from year 1 into 2, interest rate changes, etc. But we are looking at a $61 million increase, gross, which is $41 million net, because within the model itself there's some debt repayment going on as well to offset the increase that is being driven from infrastructure. And you'll see we're still on that trajectory with regards to closing in on our self-imposed limit of 2.5 times our revenue by year 2029, which is year 5 of the plan. And that increase in debt is, again, a reflection of the significant investment into our capital works program. So what's driving that 61 million? You'll see there that by far the largest proportion is wastewater and stormwater, followed by the museum. Again, more wastewater levels of service. So one is the wastewater treatment plant, and the other is all those other aspects such as finishing Rotorua, Rotorua, Tarawera, etc. Water supply expansions, water supply enhancements, and so by and far most of it is being driven from our core infrastructure, or as you can see there, Titoki Place, finishing the investment into that sports field, $1 million in extra into a pensioner housing refurbishment, but by far predominantly all supporting those big key projects that underpin our long-term plan. And so then...
Just a quick question on that one. I know things like the Sala Street Chapel have already been deferred. I see, and I think Aquatic Centre may have changed, but there may be some things in here that are a cost, but there may also be a revenue line alongside it that eventually covers that cost. When we talk details later, I just wouldn't want... obviously, everything we're investing in has some sort of benefit to the community, one way or another, but it would be really useful if there is a revenue line as well as the cost for that to be explained to us at some later stage.
Yep, 100%, Your Worship. Yep.
Thank you.
And then my final slide, so the second last slide, I did very well to get us as quickly through this as possible. So year 2 was 9.8, and so what we do know is things have changed, and we need to model those, and we will do that in the coming weeks and show you what that impact is. And so on the 9.8, we do have upward pressure with regards to the Infracore integration, so we are moving quite rapidly towards the disestablishment of that CCO back into council on the 31 October, and we know that there's some challenges there that we'd likely need to support. And I think in another environment, I think I indicated it's likely to be at least $1 million to support Infracore. Events and venues as well, that's coming out and going to Rotorua NZ. We know that the environment there is challenging, and there's a little bit of a delta towards the budgets that sit there with regards to revenue, and so we are having to support Rotorua NZ as they pick that up and work towards closing that gap. And historically, when it sat within council, we were able to cash flow that shortfall across our whole wider range of opportunities, and that shortfall was about $1.3 million. Against a total operating budget of $200 million, it's easier to offset and absorb that, but when you're moving that activity to an entity that has total revenues of $4.5 million, it's a little bit harder for them to do that. So we are needing to provide some support as they work towards doing that. Increased depreciation. So just this year alone from our roading revaluation that we've just undertaken as part of our annual report, we've got an additional $4 million of depreciation, which we hadn't anticipated on. And so while our long-term plan does its best estimate of forecasting what assets will likely revalue to and the corresponding depreciation, we're still kind of on the back of that high inflationary environment of when we created our long-term plan, and are still seeing quite significant uplifts in our asset values through renewals, which then flows through, revals, which flows through to our renewals. So we'll have to see how we can deal with that. Potential community halls investment. Local water's done well with regards to putting a pre-agreed plan to the DIA for approval, or having a discussion with the community on alternatives. We've got our IT offsite disaster recovery that needs to be responded to as well. We've made some provision in our long-term plan, but we'll likely need a little bit more, and that's with regards to the partnership with the DHB, and where the DHB, or the New Zealand Health, is going down a different pathway with regards to their on-site IT infrastructure. The museum exhibition, which is 100% funded, need to have a discussion around the impact of that on the project. And then we've got potentially some downward pressure as well with regards to, while the inflation factors held or slightly declined in some places, there's an overall trend down, not probably to the level of what maybe the public would expect. There are some lower interest rates, so our interest rates have declined, I'd say quite rapidly in the last couple of months, and so getting an understanding of what that forward trajectory looks like and the impact of that. Deferral of FOGO, and particularly around the organisational reset 2024, around what are those opportunities that may fall out of that and create some downward pressure. And so going forward, this workshop was intended to be brief with regards to just an update and of where the world sits, and a little context of where we were. In about 3 weeks, we'll have workshop number 2, where we'll discuss elected members' opportunities. So we'll get some feedback from yourselves, and we'll look to do some modellings and proposals for you to consider, through to workshop 3 and so forth. So happy to stop there and answer any other questions elected members may have.
Thank you. Got a question from Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just circling back to this increased depreciation due to 2024 asset revaluation, and also depreciation rates. This particular table is probably not a good example of an asset, but the water assets are, which account for 1 point something or other billion dollars. So who determines what the depreciation rate for the water assets ought to be?
So again, Councillor, our asset management plans underpin that. So if you think about our water assets, it's made up of, I don't know what the value of it is at the moment, but we're closing on $2 billion worth of assets. Overall, water probably makes up 400 to 500 million of that, and it's made up of a whole range of things. And so each of those big significant assets has asset management plans that identify the critical components and their useful lives and how they should be maintained. And that's what ultimately, and each of those components also has an industry standard with regards to their useful lives. And then you overlay environmental factors, age, a whole range of things to determine the remaining useful lives and how you depreciate it. So I think it's very important to not get stuck on the IRD and the depreciation rate, which is a very blanket approach to tax versus how we manage our assets and look after them. And ultimately that's where, and how much of the life of an asset we consume, and that's where we arrive at our depreciation rates.
Yes, so there's been a bigger appreciation in the asset value, so consequently we've got a bigger depreciation cost.
Yep.
But
which flows on to having to
spend a
spend
transaction, isn't it?
Well, no, because then it's ultimately reflected in the team's ability to do renewal work as well. And so if you think about, I've got $1 million asset and it doubles in value because that's what it now costs to reinstate it, and I'm doing a renewal on a component of that, and I've made a $50,000 allowance to renew a component of that. Well, the reality is it's probably going to cost now closer to $100,000, if not more, to renew that component because that whole asset value has increased.
Okay. What's the status of FOGO? I see here it's there's a deferral mentioned.
Excuse me, Madam Chair, could I just ask you, sorry to interrupt Councillor Lee, but sorry, the last time we discussed FOGO was in confidential because we gave a direction to the CE. So just a reminder there that we have to be a little bit careful we don't get too much into detail around, if I recall correctly.
Yes, I understand there's still discussions
Pretty sure I do.
being undertaken on that contract, potentially.
Okay, thank you.
But we will get your question answered outside of this if you wish. And I'll just check if there are any further questions at this stage. Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess it does go to what you've just said about confidentiality. I'm concerned that nothing here is about the Tarawera project as far as changes impacting year 2 rates. There's no doubt there is going to be some increased costs. Have we factored that in?
No, not yet. So again, councillors, what I've just shown you is year 2 as per the long-term plan that was adopted 4 months ago. And I'll just come back one slide, Rob. Yep. Once you've had the next 2 workshops, what we'll do is we'll talk about that upward pressure, downward pressure, and how it will all come together and what the impact is. But we're aware that there are things that are currently underway that will impact that 9.8%.
Thank you.
Thank you. And there has already been communications from the organisation out in public that additional costs will be ring-fenced for a future decision of council. We also will have a future decision of council when the Chief Executive comes back to us with the report on where that $2 million could be, or how it could be allocated to the Tarawera community, was the resolution from the council meeting in public. So it is on its way, further information. Just check if there are any final questions. There appear to be none, but just a reminder to elected members and everyone, we will now take this information. You can have some time to consider it. We'll collate some feedback from yourselves to give to staff. If there are any significant changes or further information that you require before the next workshop in 3 weeks, that will allow us plenty of time for our staff to be able to prepare that. Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just, are we still doing the brainstorming session on Wednesday?
Yes, and that's where we'll get any additional feedback or any further information that you need. And the idea is that we can give that feedback to staff as soon as possible so that they are ready for the next workshop if there's any further information that you require.
Thank you.
Thank you. And also, of course, gives you an opportunity to consider what we've just had presented to us. Councillor O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could I just seek clarification, please, and follow up to what Councillor Patterson's just asked? So the brainstorming is on Wednesday. Sorry, could I just ask on the workshop 2, 18th of 11th, elected members' opportunities, is that like for us to again, similar to the brainstorming, to put suggestions forward, or, sorry, just with the wording on it, could you clarify what's?
Yeah, I'll let Thomas answer and then I'll see if I add.
Thank you.
What we hope to get is of your brainstorming feedback, and so what this does is it gives us 3 weeks to consider that feedback and come back to you on the 18th with regards to the impact and what that looks like. And so that is the purpose of it, is my understanding.
And also it would be a lot more helpful than coming back together in 3 weeks and staff not having the information or having done the financial modelling required to be able to give us an answer. Okay. Thank you. Well, there seems to be no further questions, so we will wrap up this first workshop. Thank you very much to Thomas and staff for preparing this overview of where we're currently at with our long-term plan year 2. Just a reminder to everyone, this is what was set in the past. There is, of course, an opportunity for us to influence that. We are currently sitting at that 9.8% rates increase, but this is certainly not final, so there will be a lot of work, as you can see in this timeline, before we land on a final rates increase, but most importantly, final decisions on what we will be investing in for our community. So I will shortly, so I'll ask Councillor Maxwell if he could please close us with a karakia.
Kia ora koutou. He karakia whakamutunga, kia whakairia te tapu, kia wate ai te ara, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha ai, haumi e, hui e, tae ki e.
Thank you very much. I declare this workshop closed. Thank you, Councillor Kiriopa.